As you kind of heard in the introduction, serving the community has been my life in one way or another for a long, long time. Many of you I've gotten to know through my profession and decades of work in the bereavement sector. And that work really helped me to get to know our community and the people who live here, and also being a part of honoring the lives of people who built our community and made it what it is today. It was a wonderful thing looking back on it to learn more about their lives, their story, and how they contributed to Rockville being what it is today. It was last year around this time that I was ready to let the community know my plans for the 2022 election. With the blessing of my family and my employer, because I do have a day job, I was ready to announce last April that I wanted to run to become mayor of Brockville after a term on council. Announcing early kind of left me wondering and waiting to see what the field was going to look like over the next few months. And a lot of work was being done behind the scenes with some great supporters of mine to get ready for a campaign. But the days kept rolling by, and we kept checking that posting on the city website, and day in and day out, there was no other candidate. So I have to tell you, on August 19th, there were a heck of a lot of pins and needles at my house that afternoon. But at about 2:15 that afternoon, I got the word that I was to be elected by acclamation. And then began the longest 3 months of my life, waiting from then till November. But alas, here we are. Because of those circumstances, though, before we move on to talk about the business of the city today, I want to repeat something that I said the night I took the oath of office, because I really feel it's important that this group hears this message. I realize that I didn't land in this position based on votes cast in my name. I certainly did land in my council position with a level of support that I'll always be very grateful for. But as mayor, I know that I entered this office under what was not normal circumstances. And I just want the community to know, while I didn't arrive in this job because of votes cast in my name, I'm working every day to try and earn those votes in the 4 years afterwards, and I promise you that. So I want to turn to a few topics that I'm sure will be of interest to all of you this morning. We're going to start with where we are, and then we're going to change topics to something nicer to think about, which is where we're going. And I suppose the biggest topic for all of you this morning, as it has been for city staff and council in the last few weeks, is our 2023 municipal budget. So I won't sugarcoat it. It was a tremendous challenge. Both council and the city staff have truly greatly struggled with this year's budget process. It represents an increase that nobody is happy about, but it's quite frustrating because the situation has more or less been forced upon us. And it's not as though your new council went out and added expensive new projects, programs, or went on some kind of a hiring spree. In fact, there's very, very little new spending in the 2023 budget. As difficult as it's been, I'm actually really appreciative that this presentation happens when it does, so I can stand in front of you today and explain to you the situation that we found ourselves in and why the result is what it is. I'll take you back to the last term. The Council of 2018 to 2022 implemented zero-based budgeting. For those of you that don't exactly know what that is, that means instead of taking last year's numbers and layering an inflationary increase on it and working within that new envelope, staff begin building their budgets from the ground up every year, line by line, from a fresh start. That proved to be a very successful approach the last 4 years, but it did put us in a situation where the city operates on a very bare bones level. And then when you hit a year like 2023 with some significant increases that I'm going to explain in a moment, there's scarcely anywhere to go to mitigate the increase. You're left with some choices: using reserves, cutting services, swallowing an increase, debt, or some combination thereof. A few people have said to me, well, why didn't you look at the payroll? Over the past 20 years, the city workforce has been substantially trimmed back from a high of 278 staff in 2003 to around 220 today. That's 20%. And to go down the unpleasant road of considering layoffs would involve cutting services. When it comes to cutting services, There aren't many services that a municipality provides that are optional. And the ones that you maybe could consider wouldn't be very popular. They'd be things like lifeguards at St. Lawrence Park, closing down the compost yard waste site, not sweeping the streets as much, maybe not plowing the sidewalks in residential neighborhoods. A little aside, the city of, you sometimes get a little frustrated waiting the few hours for the sidewalk plow to hit your neighborhood. In the city of Regina, you have to shovel your own sidewalks in front of your house, and you're fined if you don't do it. But even if it came to those kinds of cuts to consider, it really wouldn't be enough dollars to significantly mitigate the new cost increases that we were dealing with. Promise you that this presentation is going to get more positive in a couple of minutes. Work with me. It sounded positive when I wrote it. So when we take into context the last couple years, and this is kind of important too, to look at it in a broader base, we've really had next to zero tax increases for the past 3 or 4 years. In her budget report to council last week, the Director of Finance notes that the actual increase in dollars on the average value assessed residential property in Brockville from 2020 to 2022 was only $13. And that's not per year, that's total, $13 in 3 years. Had taxes raised even the level of CPI over those 3 years, it would have been $100 over those 3 years. When we started budget 2023, however, inflation last September was 6.9, as everybody in this room knows, and we had 2 major cost increases that we really couldn't do anything about. The first was the provincial OMERS pension plan had made a policy decision that came into effect on January 1st, where all non-full-time city employees, right down to the summer students, are eligible to join the OMERS pension plan. Now that's voluntary. It'll depend on how many of those non-full-time employees decide to enter the program, but there's a matching element. So if they enter, the city must match. And we forecast that expenditure is going to be about $472,000 for 2023. The second and much more significant increase was with our solid waste and recycling. In the fall of 2022, our 10-year contract for waste and recycling expired. Last summer, city staff issued an RFP with the full expectation that there'd be several bids that would come back for us to evaluate. Well, that turned out not to be the case. Only one company submitted a bid, and the contract was going to cost $2 million a year more than we were paying at the time, or triple what the annual expense was. So to put that into context, it's a good time to mention that for every $380,000 of increase of expenses, that equates to a 1% hike on the tax levy. Had we been forced to accept that proposal so that our garbage would still get picked up each week, with what seemed to be the only option available at the time, that $2 million increase would have meant 5% on your taxes alone before anything else. So this was the last term of council, and needless to say, staff and council at the time were very taken aback by the situation. To only have one bid, it goes to show there's been so much consolidation in the waste and recycling industry that we're not big enough to entice many of the remaining players, but we're too big for many of the small-scale operators. Brockville's a bit of a weird size on many things, and this is one of them. So I want to really credit the city staff who went to work and worked very hard with a local contractor to find a made-in-Brockville solution to the waste and recycling contract. And that contractor's, by all accounts, really doing an incredible job. The level of service under the previous provider had certainly dramatically slipped. You might remember last winter, certain times when we really didn't know what day the garbage was going to get picked up, coming down to the end of the last contract. And I live on a house that overlooks a corner, and one of my neighbors knew that my home office, could see that corner, and it was quite a bad week in the garbage schedule, and he got out a can of black spray paint and painted along the snowbank, "Matt, when is garbage day?" So, you got a problem. So I think we've all noticed that the new service is providing excellent service. They're doing a wonderful job And it's really great that we're keeping those dollars local, but it's still translated into a significant increase in the cost over the previous 10-year-old contract. You know, looking back is an easy thing to do, isn't it? And it probably seemed like a wonderful idea 10 years ago to lock in the cost of that really expensive service for so long. But we see what happens with 10 years of inflation in between, and we certainly realize that costs go up when it's 10 years before you evaluate the cost of a service. So there we are. So when you add these two major impacts, the waste contract and OMERS, along with increase in fuel costs, and we also had a fairly major hit with the United Counties and the WSIB liability related to the paramedic service. When you add all those things together, there's about $2 million of extra costs that needed to be funded this year that are kind of like a one-time hit to the budget. I mean, they'll carry on after, but it all hits at the same time. Therefore, before looking at any of our regular budget process at all, we're basically starting at 5% this year. Pretty tough position to be in for any municipality. By now, many of you know where we ended up. The budget approved last week equates to a tax rate increase of 7.37%. That's about 0.5% over the annual CPI inflation rate in Canada for 2022. But if we pulled out those major one-time cost increases, we'd have only been in the 3% range. And when I look around the county, last night Prescott approved their budget at 3.68. My friend Mayor Burrow recently 4.65, and Elizabethtown Kitley, Rideau Lakes 3.76, and the United Counties, who didn't have a major increase in picking up garbage for residents, is 6.87. So just trying to put it all in perspective with what's going on around us. Now, what does that mean in dollars? And I think that's what's really important to people. We're still using the 2016 assessed property values because MPAC put on pause reevaluation of properties during the pandemic, and we don't have a definitive date of when they're going to reassess. So 2016 values is what we've got. The average assessed value of a residential property in Brockville is $250,000. So we really need to please drive home. This is the assessment we're looking at. I know that that house's neighbor sold for $1 million last year, but assessment, we're working with $250,000 as the average value of a property. That average property will pay about $250 more in property taxes for 2023. It shakes out to 98 cents per thousand in assessment. And in the world we live in, where most of us pay for things on a monthly basis, call it $20 a month. For budget 2024, these extraordinary increases that we faced will already be funded. And I certainly hope to be standing here next year telling you a far different story, but we aren't going to wait around to find out. City staff are already working on a 3-year budget forecast for the balance of this term. We'll still have an annual process to review and factor in considerations, but it's going to give us a really good financial roadmap for knowing what our priorities are, especially around infrastructure for the balance of the term. So at the end of this presentation, I'm going to be really happy to take any questions that you want to send my way about the budget or anything else, but I'd like to move on from where we are to where we're heading. Now that the budget's complete, our next plan is we're going to be holding a series of council planning sessions, and our first installment comes up tomorrow night. We have retained an excellent facilitator, a longtime mayor in Central Ontario and a past city manager, Rob Adams, not this Rob Adams, his twin, who's going to lead council through a priority setting exercise over the next several weeks. To give you an example of this, we did a similar exercise last term, and we set some priorities that included the replacement of our marina infrastructure, which is complete, moving forward with the development of Reynolds Park, which you all know is underway, getting the arena expansion project shovel ready, and the drawings are being drawn at this time, and finally, our number one priority was acquiring the Woolworths property and turning it over for redevelopment. I'm going to talk in more detail about that in a second. So these sessions that we start tomorrow night will lead us to a new priority list, and council members will be able to bring forward their ideas and priorities, and by consensus we'll select where we will go and where we'll drive our efforts for the rest of the term. Now you might say, well, you guys got elected in October and you took your office in December. It's not unusual to do this now because the first thing of a municipal council has to do in Ontario, because of the cycle of our elections, is deal with their budget. And we already covered that. On the where we're going side of the ledger, besides this training exercise, one of the big things ahead in this term is Woolworths. So as I mentioned, it was a priority of the last term and it's an ongoing project. I know the last time this presentation was given by Mayor Calavas, he let you know we were getting closer to seeing a solution. And I remember saying a few months away. Well, it actually did happen that way. But I just want to share you a little bit of the background and where we're at on that project. Simply put, last term, a number of us decided that the time had come to do something about the situation of one of the most important, or at least one of the most visible properties on our city's main street. No one wanted to look at this boarded up building any longer, and if the private sector was going to do something about it, they would have done something about it by that time. As such, we set it as a priority, and the city was able to take ownership of the property at the end of 2020. And we immediately put into play an RFP seeking a candidate to redevelop the space based on a criteria that council had developed after consulting with the community. It didn't really cost us much in the way of cash because the city has other tools the private sector does not. We've got so little into it that I would personally say if we didn't get that small investment back, as long as the site gets developed, we'll get the benefit anyway. However, I'm pretty confident that our financial input will get returned to us. But here's where things stand. In August of last year, we entered into an agreement of purchase and sale with an organization called Caber, which is Ottawa-based. The transaction is conditional on them receiving a site plan approval within 1 year of entering into the agreement, and then 1 year later, obtaining a building permit. There's been substantial communication going on with Caber from August through to now. And I know the community gets really impatient when they don't actually see things starting and buildings coming down and new buildings going up. You know, the city's very much like watching a duck on the water. It doesn't look like much is going on until you realize how fast the feet are paddling underneath. And that's exactly the story here. There has been substantial communication with Caber. They've got a very successful track record in the National Capital Region, and they're getting ready to bring forward a Planning Act application within the next few months. It's going to be a mix of commercial space, especially on the ground floor, which is required along King Street, and upper level rental residential and underground parking. At least that's what the concept is sounding like. We won't exactly know until we have the application in front of us. And I have not seen any numbers on this, so this is only my guesstimate, but judging from the developer's vision and comparing that to the numbers that we know about the St. Vincent de Paul project on James Street, this is going to be likely between a $20 and $30 million investment in our downtown core. I really have to believe that this is going to be a game changer for downtown Brockville. Again, I realize it's a long process, but you're dealing with the private sector, with someone that's got to spend a colossal amount of money to make this happen, and these things take time. So be patient just a little longer, and I'm sure as we get into spring and summer, and certainly before that 1 year anniversary of entering into the agreement, I think we're going to see some movement on this file. Other economic good news. Our industrial sector, we're now fortunate to have the Leclerc family established in the newest plant in Brockville, and they tell me they're extremely happy to be here. Local officials are gathering later this week for an opening celebration. This certainly represents a tremendous amount of hard work by the economic development teams, both at the City of Brockville and our partners in the St. Lawrence Corridor Economic Development Commission. Not only is Leclerc set up and running, but they're focused on the future, and I believe we've only seen the beginning. Of note, nearly all of their 200 or so hires are locals. They didn't bring people necessarily into town. Those are good jobs that have gone to local people who needed them. We've seen several other local industries expand their operations over the last couple of years, and I have to tell you, my first meeting with the Economic Development, the Corridor Commission was certainly a very thrilling experience. And we have some people in the room that are part of that group, none the least than the chair, Shelley Bacon, who's doing a great job leading that team. And it was a very exciting group to join as a new mayor. The good problem that we have is we're in an era where there are more jobs available in our industrial sector than we have a skilled workforce to fill. There's varying stats on it, and Shelley could probably tell you with more authority than I could, but somewhere around 500 jobs at any given time go unfilled with our industrial constituents. Add to that the need to recruit more healthcare workers with our friends Nick and his staff here today, of course, would tell you at BGH there's about 100 vacancies at any given time. There are plenty of good available jobs here right now. We could do a whole session on our aging demographics and how important it is to grow our population. But right now, let's focus in on how this situation impacts our housing situation, because that was one of the #1 issues that came out of the election last fall. The people to fill these jobs are going to need to be attracted to move here, and they're going to need homes. So let me update you a little bit on the housing situation in Brockville. During the municipal election, I was given a stat that between projects approved, pending approval, or under development, there was in the vicinity of 2,400 residential units in play in those categories. Even when those are all built up, don't worry, we still have capacity for more residential development. That doesn't build out Brockville, but that's what's in play at the moment. The challenge is always in actually getting them built. The city can simply approve the applications. We don't build houses. That's the private sector. But the good news is there are shovels in the ground and construction going on at several locations in the city. And the last term of council, it was pretty exciting to approve Wellings on Parkdale, St. Albans in the East End, eventually 550 King West, right around the corner here, to receive the application for Windsor Centennial. I think that's probably more subdivisions in one term than in many, many years in Brockville. Plus, some of the existing subdivisions were moving on and adding their next phases. So there's really a lot going on in residential construction. We're all, of course, concerned about affordability, and there's a lot of discussion on that topic right now. There's a lot of definitions of that term out there as well. There's also a lot of discussion about the reduction of municipal fees to make housing more affordable. That's pretty, front page news these days, especially for our friend MPP Clark, who heads that portfolio in our province. Well, in our situation, those fees have traditionally always been low, and we in fact exempted not-for-profit housing from development charges long before anyone ever heard of Bill 23. Unlike Mississauga, where municipal fees for a single-family home are in the six figures, it's only a few $1,000s here in Brockville for those same fees. So what we as a municipality are left to be able to do and have been doing in making homes more affordable is to work with developers on the mix of homes that they're building. And the other thing that we did that we were really proud of on National Housing Day was we helped out a very important project that, through no fault of their own, ran into a lot of difficulty with the current financial climate, which is the Margarita Residence Corporation, the St. Vincent de Paul project. Our council stepped forward to put into place a funding arrangement so that construction could get completed, and that's upwards of 90 below-market rent seniors apartments for our city. The recent approvals that we've seen come across the desk show that builders have identified affordability as an issue as well in our community, because their applications are for less and less expensive single-family homes and a higher proportion of semis and towns, the type of homes that help people get their foot into the market. Now, I talk to builders all the time, and builders tell me that new construction by its very nature, even with a different mix, is still expensive. There's no getting around that. Council can't mandate that the price of a 2x4 is less because we want affordable housing. It just doesn't work that way. nor that the builder, the construction worker, is going to get paid less to build a more affordable home because they have a family to feed too. But all these projects, even though it'll be new construction and not the most affordable house in town, all these projects are going to increase inventory. And in some cases, that'll mean people in existing homes in Brockville will move up in the market, and that'll open up opportunities in resales, which usually tend to be more affordable than new. We drastically need more rental accommodations, and rents have certainly increased. There's an ongoing challenge of landlords being able to recover costs and get a reasonable return on their rent, on their investment, and tenants being able to afford the rent. And we actually had a very interesting session with the United Counties and local landlords last night, and learned a great deal about the struggles of that business community. We have multi-residential buildings both under construction and approved for construction or working through approvals that will surely help in this area. I mentioned that there's a lot of definitions of affordable out there, it seems, and I think a lot of people confuse affordable with subsidized. We often hear remarks where people seem to think that the city can build and provide affordable housing, and I think they really mean subsidized housing when they say that, but most don't really understand the division of the different levels of government and the services provided. It's the province who decides who the social housing providers are in any region, and they split the province up into 50 regions. So in our area, the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville is the social housing provider. The city does not have a housing division. We have a planning department and we have a building department to issue permits, but we don't have our own stock of social housing. The United Counties do, and we sit at that table and we pay our portion of the assessment. That doesn't mean that the United Counties can build subsidized housing on their own either, because you got to remember that municipalities' only source of revenue is you, the residential, commercial, and industrial taxpayer. And I'm not sure any of you want your property taxes going up so that we can bring in dollars to subsidize a home for someone else. The dollars to build subsidized housing flow from the federal level down to the province and down to the designated service provider in the region. That's how these projects work. So having said all that, the only way that more subsidized housing is going to get built in Brockville is if our federal government finally starts flowing some of those dollars to smaller communities. Because right now, the National Housing Strategy dollars are all going to large cities. Obviously, the needs are strong there with the levels of immigration and so forth that are reaching those areas, but it's coming at the expense of communities like ours. And when people think that the municipality should solve this problem by building houses, it's only your dollars that we have to work with. And so please understand that for that to happen, it's our federal partners that need to make it happen. All that to say, there are some things that we can do. Planning experts have told me Brockville's fastest source of affordable housing is the creation of secondary suites within the existing housing stock. You could always do that, but now as of right with Bill 23, communities must permit secondary suites and in fact tertiary units. We're working on our policies to amend them to come into compliance with the changes of Bill 23 to make all that happen. But Brockville seems to be a prime community for this to occur. The reason we're a prime community for this to occur is because we're aging so fast, there are less and less people living under each of our roofs. We're down to what's probably a provincial low of 1.5 people per household. So the houses we have capacity for more people to live in them. I know it's not for everybody to think about setting up an apartment in your basement, but it can be done, and some are doing it. And if you're interested in doing it, the United Counties even has a loan program available to help with up to $50,000 available in eligible circumstances. A few housing stats. I've mentioned approvals and so forth. Actual housing starts since the pandemic have been very strong. We had 133 units in 2021, which was the highest number since Tall Ships Landing in 2011. We had 88 units at the end of last year that had been built, and 34 others were just waiting for their permits to be issued. That was the end of December, so I'm sure by now that has happened, and we're anticipating strong numbers again this year. Other good things that are happening, the Northern Cables expansion continues, and we had the new 3M plant and Canarm expansion during the pandemic. 3 industries during the pandemic growing. that's a pretty great thing, a great record to have. We've got the new school being built around the corner in King West. We've got Westminster School expanding. We've got the conversion of Prince of Wales School into residential property. Enbridge is building a new office and yard on Central West. There's redevelopment at the Thousand Islands Mall, a new RV center in case you want to get away from all this stuff on Stewart Boulevard. And I just got to cut the ribbon at a new pet store called Wren's Pets with no W in the old Future Shop building on Parkdale on Saturday. And finally, to round this out on a little good news, we've officially entered spring. Today is the official full first day of spring, and recent stats show that our tourism sector is definitely rebounding. 2022 was a very, very favorable year. The great indicator is the municipal accommodation tax revenues. When I first joined council, and that was a new revenue source, it was forecast to produce around $400,000 a year. And there's a report in front of Standing Committee tonight saying that last year we received $536,000 in municipal accommodation tax. So granted, there's been inflation to the cost of renting a hotel room that delivers a higher dollar value of MAT tax, but all indications are that people are finding their way to Brockville. They're enjoying their visits, and they're staying a little longer. And I just want to make sure and hit home the point, this did not happen overnight. This is the credit of many, many years of building and hard work by this organization in in building the momentum that's led to the great results that we're seeing of late. So thank you for that. So I look forward to our city getting its annual spring cleanup in the next few weeks. Boats in the slips, the new slips in the harbor, the tulips on Courthouse, and hopefully one of the best tourism seasons we've seen in a long time in our post-COVID, hopefully post-COVID era that we're entering. So with that, once again, thank you all for being here this morning. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. Thanks for your friendship, your support, and as long as nobody throws any toast towards the front of the room, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. So thank you for being here today.